March 25th, 1420. A narrow dam between two ponds near the village of Sudoměř in southern Bohemia. The one-eyed veteran standing atop a wooden wagon surveyed the approaching disaster with the cold calculation of a man who had long ago made peace with death. Jan Zizka of Trocnov was 60 years old, a mercenary, a bandit, a former royal courtier who had fought at Grunwald against the Teutonic Knights a decade earlier. Now he commanded 400 peasants, townsmen, women and children huddled behind 12 farm carts, hastily chained together on a strip of land barely wide enough for a road. Approaching from two directions were 2,000 mounted knights in full plate armour, the Iron Lords of Bohemia, professional warriors who had spent their lives training for this moment. The mathematics were simple and brutal. 5-to-1 odds, heavily armoured cavalry against farmers with pitchforks, knights who could afford armour that cost more than a village against peasants who wore cloth and leather. This should have been a massacre. The knights thought so. The peasants knew it. Even Zizka, calculating the angles with his remaining eye, understood the razor's edge they stood upon. What none of them knew, what the armoured knights thundering toward those wagons could never have imagined, was that they were witnessing the birth of a revolution in warfare that would echo through the centuries. Within hours, these farm carts would transform from transportation into fortification, from civilian tools into military weapons. The flails used to thresh grain would crack through the finest armour Europe could produce. The primitive firearms dismissed as novelties by the knightly class would prove that the age of the mounted knight was entering its final chapter. This is the story of how 12 wagons changed the face of European warfare, how peasants with agricultural implements defeated the flower of Catholic chivalry, and how one brilliant tactician named Jan Zizka turned weakness into strength and created a weapon that would terrify Europe for decades. This is the story of when war wagons first rolled into battle and shocked European knights at the Battle of Sudoměř. To understand what happened on that muddy strip of land between two ponds, we need to go back 5 years to a church council in the city of Constance. On July 6, 1415, a Czech priest named Jan Hus was burned at the stake for heresy. His crime was preaching church reform, criticising the wealth and corruption of the Catholic hierarchy, and translating scripture into Czech so common people could read it. Hus had promised safe conduct to the council. That promise was broken. The church decided that promises to heretics didn't count. They tied him to a stake, placed a paper crown on his head painted with devils, and set him alight. According to witnesses, Hus sang hymns as the flames consumed him, refusing to recant even as his flesh burned. His execution was meant to stamp out dissent. It achieved the opposite. In Bohemia, outrage exploded. Hus had been popular, his message resonating with peasants tired of church tithes they couldn't afford, and nobles resentful of German domination within the Holy Roman Empire. The priest's martyrdom transformed a reform movement into something far more dangerous: armed revolt. In the summer of 1419, the fuse finally reached the powder keg. On July 30th, Hussite protesters in Prague marched to the new town hall, demanding the release of imprisoned reformers. When the Catholic councillors refused, the mob threw them out the windows. This was the first defenestration of Prague, and it inaugurated 20 years of religious war that would devastate Central Europe. King Wenceslaus IV, shocked by the violence, died 2 weeks later, possibly of a stroke brought on by the stress. His half-brother Sigismund, King of Hungary, and soon-to-be Holy Roman Emperor, prepared to claim the Bohemian throne. But the Hussites knew Sigismund. He had guaranteed Hus safe conduct to Constance, then allowed his execution. They would die before accepting him as their king. The stage was set for war. The Hussite movement wasn't unified. It fractured into factions almost immediately. The moderates, called Utraquists, wanted limited reforms within the church structure. They were largely urban, educated, and willing to negotiate. But the radicals, the Taborites, wanted complete reformation. They took their name from Mount Tabor in the Bible, site of Christ's transfiguration, and they established a new settlement in southern Bohemia that they called Tabor, organising it along communal military lines. The Taborites were revolutionary in every sense. They abolished class distinctions within their community, shared property, and prepared for the apocalyptic final battle they believed was coming. They were also militarily organised from the beginning because they knew what was coming. The Catholic Church and the Holy Roman Empire would not tolerate this heresy. They would come with armies, and those armies would be composed of the finest heavy cavalry in Europe. In early 1420, Pope Martin V issued a papal bull declaring a crusade against the Hussites. This wasn't metaphorical. This was a full crusade with all the religious authority and temporal power that entailed. Sigismund began assembling armies. The Hungarian nobility rallied. German princes prepared their troops. The Bohemian Catholic lords who had remained loyal to Rome mustered their forces. The Hussites faced annihilation by the combined military might of Catholic Europe. They needed a military leader who could turn farmers and craftsmen into soldiers, who could overcome the overwhelming disadvantage in equipment and training, who could find a way to make peasant infantry stand against the charge of armoured knights. They found him in Jan Zizka. Zizka's early life is poorly documented, shrouded in the mists of history and later legend. We know he was born around 1360 in the village of Trochnov in southern Bohemia to a family of lower nobility, the kind with a small amount of land and a lot of pride but little actual wealth. His surname Zizka means roughly one-eyed in Czech, though historians debate whether this was his birth name or a nickname acquired later. What we know for certain is that he lost one eye early in life, probably in his youth, though the circumstances are unknown. Some suggest a childhood accident, others a fight. The truth is lost. As a young man, Zizka served at the royal court of King Wenceslaus IV, eventually becoming chamberlain to Queen Sophia of Bavaria. Court records from the period are sparse, but we know he held a position of some trust, suggesting capability and political acumen. But the peaceful life of a courtier didn't suit him. By the early 1400s, Zizka had fallen in with less savoury company. Documents from 1408 show him involved with a bandit group operating in southern Bohemia, conducting raids and holding people for ransom. This wasn't uncommon for minor nobles who lacked sufficient income. Banditry and mercenary work were respectable, if dangerous career paths. In 1410, at roughly 50 years old, Zizka fought at the Battle of Grunwald, one of the largest battles in medieval Europe, where Polish and Lithuanian forces crushed the Teutonic Knights. He likely served with a Bohemian noble named John Sokol who fought for the Polish king. Whether Zizka distinguished himself at Grunwald is unknown, but he survived, and he gained something invaluable: experience in large-scale warfare, understanding of tactics and terrain, recognition that cavalry, even elite heavy cavalry, could be defeated with proper preparation. After Grunwald, Zizka disappears from records for nearly a decade, presumably returning to Bohemia and his various occupations, legitimate and otherwise. He resurfaces in 1419 during the first defenestration of Prague, where he played a prominent role in the Hussite uprising. When King Wenceslaus died shortly after, and the Hussites began organising for war, they turned to this grizzled one-eyed veteran. He was nearly 60, ancient by medieval standards, when he became a military commander. Most of his life was behind him. He would be blind within 2 years and dead within 4. But in those 4 years, Jan Zizka would revolutionise European warfare and establish himself as one of history's great military commanders, a man who never lost a battle. His genius lay not in tactical brilliance alone, though he possessed that. His genius was recognising that the Hussites' weaknesses could become strengths if properly exploited. They had no heavy cavalry. Fine. Cavalry required open ground to operate. Choose terrain where cavalry couldn't manoeuvre. They had no plate armour. Good. Armour slowed men down and cost a fortune to make. Equip soldiers with weapons they already knew how to use. Farm implements. They had no trained soldiers. Perfect. Train them to fight defensively from fortified positions where discipline mattered more than individual skill. The first test of these ideas came in December 1419 at the Battle of Neckmies, more of a running fight than a proper battle, where Zizka successfully extracted his forces from a bad position. But the real test, the first pitched battle where these revolutionary concepts would prove themselves, came 4 months later on March 25th, 1420, at a place called Sudoměř. In March 1420, Zizka found himself in Pilsen, a city in western Bohemia, with a small contingent of Taborite followers. Pilsen's moderates had grown uncomfortable with the radicals in their midst. They negotiated with the approaching Catholic forces. The message to Zizka was clear: leave. On March 23rd, Zizka departed Pilsen with approximately 400 people. This wasn't a military force in any traditional sense. Yes, there were fighting men, perhaps 200 capable of bearing arms, but there were also women, children, the elderly, carts carrying supplies and belongings. This was a refugee column fleeing persecution, heading south toward Tabor where they could find safety among fellow radicals. Among those 400 were craftsmen from the towns, farmers from the countryside, a handful of minor nobles who had thrown in with the Hussite cause. They had 12 wagons loaded with supplies. They had some crossbows, a few early firearms called handguns or pistols, primitive weapons that were slow to load and not particularly accurate but made an impressive noise. Most were armed with agricultural implements, flails for threshing grain, now studded with nails and iron spikes, pitchforks, scythes, clubs. These were not professional soldiers, but they had faith. Faith in their cause, faith in the righteousness of Jan Hus's message, and faith in the one-eyed commander who led them. They would need that faith. Because word of their departure reached the Catholic forces almost immediately. Lord Bohuslav of Schwamberg was a Catholic nobleman who commanded forces from the West Bohemian Landfried, a regional defence league. When he learned that Zizka's group had left Pilsen, he saw opportunity. 400 peasants on the march, encumbered by civilians and wagons, far from any support. This was a chance to crush a Hussite force and capture or kill Jan Zizka himself, sending a message to all potential rebels about the consequences of defying the church and the crown. Bohuslav gathered his forces. From Strakonice came Jindřich of Hradec, prior of the Knights Hospitaller, also called Knights of St. John, with roughly 1,000 mounted knights. From Kutna Hora came the Mintmaster Mikš of Jemniště, and Peter von Konopisht of Sternberg with another 1,000 cavalry. In total, approximately 2,000 mounted warriors, the cream of Bohemian Catholic nobility and their retainers. These were not ordinary soldiers. These were professional, warriors who had trained their entire lives for mounted combat. They wore full plate armour, the most advanced protective equipment in the world. A complete suit included helmet, gorget to protect the throat, pauldrons for shoulders, rear braces and vambraces for upper and lower arms, gauntlets for hands, breastplate and backplate, fold and tassets protecting abdomen and thighs, cuisses and polins for thighs and knees, greaves for shins, and sabatons for feet. This armour, called Gothic plate after the Holy Roman Empire workshops that produced it, was just coming into full development in 1420. It represented hundreds of hours of skilled craftsmanship by master armourers. It weighed 60 to 70 pounds but was articulated at the joints, allowing surprising mobility. Most importantly, it was nearly invulnerable to the weapons peasants could afford. Swords bounced off, arrows glanced away, spears couldn't penetrate. A knight in full plate was a walking tank, and his warhorse, sometimes itself partially armoured, could smash through infantry formations like a battering ram. The Catholic force pursued Zizka's column southward through the Bohemian countryside. They were confident. 2,000 armoured cavalry against 400 peasants. This wasn't war, this was extermination. On March 25th, Zizka's scouts reported the enemy approaching from two directions, converging on their position. The Hussites were near the village of Sudoměř, passing through terrain dominated by fish ponds, artificial lakes created for aquaculture that dotted the Bohemian landscape. Zizka surveyed the ground with his one good eye and made his decision. They would not run. Running meant being caught in the open, being run down by cavalry who could move far faster than a refugee column. They would stand. But they would stand on ground of his choosing. Between two large ponds, the Skarady Pond and the Markovec Pond, ran a narrow dam, a raised causeway perhaps a few dozen yards wide. The Skarady Pond had been partially drained, leaving muddy, marshy ground. The Markovec Pond was full. This narrow strip of land between them was the only practical route for an army to take through this area. Zizka ordered his 12 wagons driven onto the dam and chained together end to end, creating a makeshift wall blocking the causeway. The wagons weren't specially designed for combat. They were ordinary farm carts, heavy wooden construction with large wheels, designed to carry supplies and equipment. But Zizka had thought about this. He had prepared. Each wagon had been reinforced with wooden planks along the sides, creating protective walls. Firing slits had been cut in these planks. Chains and hooks had been added to link the wagons together. Inside and behind the wagons, Zizka positioned his fighters. The crossbowmen and men with handguns took positions inside the wagons, where they could fire through the slits while protected from return fire. The infantry, armed with Their farm implements and a few proper weapons crouched behind the wagon line, invisible to the approaching cavalry. The positioning was brilliant. The narrow dam meant the Catholic cavalry couldn't deploy their full numbers. They couldn't outflank because the ponds blocked movement on both sides. They would have to attack straight ahead into prepared defences, and those defences were unlike anything European knights had encountered. This wasn't a shield wall, which cavalry could break with repeated charges. This wasn't a castle, which required siege equipment. This was something new, a mobile fortification, a wagon fort. The Hussites took position in the early afternoon. They could see the Catholic army approaching, sunlight glinting off thousands of metal surfaces, the thunder of hooves shaking the ground. According to some accounts, the Hussites initially raised a white flag, attempting surrender. If this happened, the Catholics refused it. They wanted blood. They wanted to make an example. That refusal to accept surrender changed history. Had the Catholics accepted, 400 peasants would have been imprisoned or executed. Jan Zizka's brief military career would have ended, and the tactical innovations being born on that muddy dam would have died unproven. Instead, the Catholics attacked. Jindřich of Hradec led the first assault with his Knights Hospitaller, roughly 1,000 mounted warriors in full plate armour carrying lances, swords and maces. The standard cavalry charge of the medieval period was a terrifying weapon. A mass of armoured men on armoured horses accelerating to a gallop presented an irresistible force. The thundering sound, the ground shaking, the wall of metal and horseflesh bearing down, created a psychological weapon as effective as the physical impact. Infantry facing such a charge often broke and ran before contact, which is exactly what the cavalry wanted. Running men could be hunted down and slaughtered with ease, but the Hussites didn't run. They crouched behind their wagons as the cavalry approached, accelerating across the dam toward the wagon wall. The knights expected the wagons to be swept aside, the peasants to scatter. They were charging an obstacle, not an army. And then, when the cavalry was perhaps 100 yards away, the obstacles opened fire. The noise must have been incredible. Dozens of handguns discharged more or less simultaneously, creating a thunderous crack and a massive cloud of smoke. These early firearms were crude. They were essentially small cannons attached to wooden stocks. A gunner would load powder and a lead ball, aim roughly in the right direction, and apply a lit match to the touch hole. The weapons were inaccurate, slow to reload, prone to misfire, and had limited range. But at close range against massed targets they were devastating. More importantly, they were terrifying. Horses, which had to be specially trained to tolerate battle, had never encountered this combination of sound, smoke, and unpredictable projectiles. They panicked. The front ranks of the cavalry charge faltered as horses reared, wheeling sideways, crashing into the horses behind them. Riders fought for control. The disciplined charge dissolved into chaos. Crossbowmen added their fire to the guns. Crossbows were more accurate and had better range than the early firearms, and they could punch through armour at close range, especially if they hit joints or weak points. Quarrels found targets. Knights fell. Horses screamed and went down, throwing their riders. The cavalry charge, that irresistible medieval weapon, broke against the wagon wall without ever making contact. The survivors of the first assault pulled back, reforming several hundred yards from the wagons. They regrouped, assessed. The initial shock of the firearms had passed. They were experienced warriors. They would adapt. Jindřich of Hradec ordered a second assault, this time dismounted. If horses couldn't reach the wagons, men would go on foot. Knights dismounted from their war horses, drew their swords and maces, and advanced toward the wagon wall. This was the proper medieval solution. Knights were trained to fight on foot as well as mounted. Their armour protected them. They would close with the peasants in hand-to-hand combat, where training and equipment would decide the issue. It should have worked. The Catholics still had overwhelming numerical superiority and far better equipment. But Zizka had thought of this too. As the dismounted knights advanced toward the wagon wall, the handgunners and crossbowmen fired again. The rate of fire was slow. Handguns took minutes to reload. But there were enough of them, firing in rotation to maintain harassment fire. And now, something else became apparent. Knights in full plate armour weigh approximately 200 to 250 pounds, counting the man and his equipment. Walking in that weight is exhausting, running is nearly impossible, and the ground between the Catholic position and the wagon wall was not good terrain. Remember, the Hussites had positioned themselves on a dam between two ponds. One pond was partially drained. The ground around the ponds was marshy. Spring in Bohemia meant rain, meant mud. The dismounted knights advancing toward the wagons were walking through increasingly difficult terrain. Their boots sank into mud. The heavy armor that protected them became a liability. Movement slowed, men struggled, and then the Hussites counterattacked. From behind the wagons, Zizka sent out his infantry. These were peasants and townsmen with flails and clubs and improvised weapons. They wore little armor, mostly leather or padded cloth. In a fair fight, one-on-one, a knight would destroy any of them. But this wasn't a fair fight. The knights were exhausted from slogging through mud in heavy armor. They were spread out, formation broken. Some were stuck in the worst of the marshy ground, armor-encumbered men, sinking to their knees, and the Hussites attacked with purpose and discipline. The flail became the signature weapon of the Hussite infantry. A flail is a farming tool for threshing grain, consisting of a long wooden handle with a shorter heavy stick or chain attached to the end. The Hussites modified them, adding metal studs, iron spikes, weighted heads. Swung properly, a flail delivered crushing force that could dent plate armor, break bones beneath it, stun or kill. More importantly, flails didn't require the precision of swords. You didn't need years of training. You swung hard at the target. The weight of the head did the work. And flails could attack from behind the protection of the wagon wall. A knight trying to climb over a wagon could be struck before he got over. A knight stuck in mud couldn't dodge. The fighting became brutal. Knights fell, their armor no protection once they were on the ground, and multiple attackers with flails and clubs could strike repeatedly. The psychological advantage had completely reversed. The knights, who had approached expecting an easy slaughter, found themselves in a nightmare. They couldn't maneuver. Their armor slowed them. The peasants they had dismissed as no threat were killing them. According to later accounts, Jindřich of Hradec himself died in this second assault, struck down by Hussite infantry. His death was a shock. The Knights Hospitaller were military religious orders, elite warriors. Their prior had just been killed by farmers with farming tools. The Catholics pulled back again. The sun was setting. They had been fighting for hours. They had made no progress. The peasants were still there, behind their wagons, defiant. Peter von Konopischt of Sternberg tried one more assault with his contingent, roughly 1,000 cavalry. He attempted to flank the Hussite position, going around through the drained pond area, looking for a weak point in the wagon wall. It was a disaster. The drained pond was a muddy nightmare. Horses couldn't cross. The cavalry dismounted and tried to advance on foot. They became completely mired, armor dragging them down into the sucking mud. They were helpless. Hussite infantry moved out from the wagon wall and methodically killed the trapped knights. Flails rose and fell, maces crushed helmets. Men in the finest armor money could buy drowned in mud or were beaten to death unable to defend themselves. Peter von Konopischt himself survived this debacle, but he would die a few months later at the Battle of Witkov Hill, another Hussite victory. The Battle of Sudoměř was ending. Night fell. Fog rolled in from the ponds, thick and heavy, reducing visibility to almost nothing. In the darkness and mist, Zizka made his decision. The Catholics had withdrawn, but they hadn't left. They still massively outnumbered the Hussites. In the morning they could bring up reinforcements, perhaps artillery. The Hussites had won the day, but they couldn't win a siege. Zizka ordered evacuation. Under cover of darkness and fog, the Hussites quietly broke camp and slipped away, moving south toward Tabor. They left behind the wagon wall no longer needed, they carried their wounded, and they left behind an astonishing number of Catholic dead. Exact casualties are impossible to determine. Medieval battle reports are notoriously unreliable, but most sources agree the Catholics suffered several hundred killed, an enormous loss for a force of 2,000. Some accounts claim as many as 500 to 700 dead, which if true would represent devastating losses. The Hussites' losses were much lighter, perhaps a few dozen killed. Among the Hussite dead was Zdeněk of Švihov, one of the co-commanders alongside Zizka, struck down during the fighting. His loss was mourned. But the Hussites had achieved something unprecedented. 400 peasants, including women and children who weren't even fighters, had withstood an entire day of assaults from 2,000 armoured cavalry, and not only survived but inflicted catastrophic casualties. This should have been impossible. In every conventional metric, the Catholics had possessed overwhelming advantages: better equipment, better training, better soldiers, vastly superior numbers, They should have swept the peasants aside, but they hadn't, because Jan Zizka had changed the rules. The Battle of Sudoměř was the first demonstration of tactics that would dominate the Hussite wars for the next 15 years. The wagon fort, called Wagenburg in German or Vozová hradba in Czech, became the signature of Hussite military operations. After Sudoměř, Zizka refined the concept. He ordered the manufacture of specialized war wagons built to military specifications, rather than converted from farm carts. These purpose-built war wagons were engineering marvels by medieval standards. Each wagon was constructed from heavy oak planks reinforced with iron bindings. The sides were built up with additional planking to create walls roughly 6 feet high, with firing slits cut at regular intervals. A hinged door or ramp on one side allowed soldiers to enter and exit quickly. The wheels were large and sturdy, able to traverse rough terrain. Each wagon carried chains, hooks, and locking mechanisms to secure it to adjacent wagons. Inside, each wagon could hold approximately 15 to 20 soldiers, a mix of handgunners, crossbowmen, and melee fighters armed with flails, spears, and halberds. Small cannons could be mounted on or between the wagons, creating mobile artillery. The wagons also carried tools, axes, spades, shovels, pickaxes, hoes, everything needed to quickly fortify a position. When preparing for battle, Hussite armies would draw their wagons into a circle or rectangle depending on numbers and terrain, creating a complete fortification. The wagons would be chained together, wheels locked. The horses would be unhitched and moved inside the ring. Gaps between wagons would be filled with movable wooden shields called mantelets. Shallow trenches would be dug outside the wagon wall. Sharpened stakes would be driven into the ground. In a matter of hours, a Hussite army could transform from a marching column into a fortified position stronger than most field fortifications. Inside the wagon fort, organization was precise. Handgunners and crossbowmen were assigned specific wagons and firing positions. Melee fighters crouched behind the wagon walls, ready to repel attackers who reached the perimeter. A reserve force of infantry and whatever cavalry the Hussites possessed waited inside the ring, ready to sally forth for counterattacks when the enemy became disordered. Commanders like Zizka would position themselves where they could observe the entire field and direct operations. The tactics were revolutionary. When facing enemy cavalry, the Hussites would form their wagon fort and wait. The handguns and crossbows would open fire at range, harassing and disrupting enemy formations. If the enemy charged, the concentrated fire from the wagons would break the charge through a combination of physical casualties and psychological shock. If the enemy dismounted and advanced on foot, the Hussites could either defend the wagon wall with their melee fighters or sally forth to engage in hand-to-hand combat, using the wagons as a base to fall back to if pressed. The wagon fort neutralized cavalry, the dominant military arm of the medieval period. It provided protection equivalent to a castle, but could be established anywhere. It allowed poorly equipped infantry to fight effectively against professional warriors, and it could be used offensively as well as defensively. A wagon fort could advance, the wagons rolling forward slowly, infantry protected behind them, turning movement into a mobile siege. This was military revolution, not evolution, revolution. Zizka had invented mobile combined arms warfare 500 years before tanks. The firearms component was crucial. Early 15th century handguns were primitive, but effective in the right circumstances. Called pistola in Czech or hand cannon in English, these weapons consisted of a metal tube attached to a wooden stock. Gunpowder and a lead ball were loaded from the muzzle, wadded tight with cloth or paper. A touch hole at the rear of the barrel was filled with fine priming powder. To fire, the gunner would steady the weapon, often resting it on the wagon wall or a forked rest, aim in the general direction of the target and apply a lit slow match to the touch hole. The priming powder would ignite, flash through the touch hole and ignite the main charge. The resulting explosion would propel the lead ball out the barrel at several hundred feet per second with enormous sound and smoke. These weapons had severe limitations. They were inaccurate beyond 50 yards. They took several minutes to reload, requiring the gunner to pour fresh powder, ram a new ball, add wadding, and refill the touch hole. They misfired frequently in rain or fog. They were dangerous to the user, sometimes exploding, but they had advantages that outweighed the limitations. They required minimal training. A peasant could learn to fire a handgun in hours, whereas training an archer took years. They were psychologically devastating. The noise, smoke, and unpredictability terrified men and especially horses. Most importantly, They could penetrate plate armour at close range. A lead ball travelling at high velocity could punch through steel plate that would turn aside sword or spear. This was revolutionary. For the first time, common soldiers with relatively cheap weapons could threaten heavily armoured knights. The Hussites deployed handguns in groups, firing by rank to maintain continuous fire. While one rank fired, another would reload. This maximised the psychological effect and ensured that attackers always faced incoming fire. The handguns were supplemented by crossbows, which were more accurate and reliable but couldn't penetrate armour as effectively. The combination was devastating. The Hussites also used artillery, primarily small cannons called hoofnice, from which we get the English word howitzer. These were breech-loading weapons that fired stone or metal projectiles weighing a few pounds. Hoofnice could be mounted on wagons or between them, creating a battery that could engage targets at several hundred yards. Artillery was used to break up enemy formations before they closed to handgun range. The Hussites pioneered the tactical use of field artillery, employing it not just in sieges but in pitched battle, something that was just beginning to emerge in European warfare. The genius of the Hussite system was integration. The wagons provided protection and mobility. The firearms provided standoff capability to disrupt enemy formations. The melee troops provided close combat power to finish enemies who closed. Infantry and cavalry in reserve provided counterattack capability. Every element supported the others. This was combined arms tactics, coordinating different types of forces to create effects greater than the sum of parts. Medieval armies typically separated their arms, cavalry fighting separately from infantry. The Hussites integrated everything into a coherent system. After Sudoměř, word spread through Bohemia and beyond. The peasant rabble had defeated professional cavalry. The Catholics were stunned. How could armoured knights lose to farmers? There had to be explanations. The Catholics had been ambushed, unprepared. The terrain had been unusually difficult. The Hussites had used witchcraft. Anything to avoid accepting the reality that the Hussites had won through superior tactics and leadership. But Sudoměř was just the beginning. 3 months later, on July 14th, 1420, Emperor Sigismund himself led a crusading army to besiege Prague. Zizka, commanding Hussite forces on Witkov Hill overlooking the city, used the wagon fort tactic to defeat a force several times larger. The emperor's army included contingents from across Europe, drawn by the promise of a crusade. They vastly outnumbered the Hussites, but they had to attack uphill against prepared positions. The wagon forts on Witkov Hill proved impregnable. The Crusaders lost hundreds of men in futile assaults and eventually withdrew. Sigismund's first crusade had failed. More would follow. Between 1420 and 1431, 5 separate crusades were launched against the Hussites. Each one failed. Catholic armies numbering tens of thousands, sometimes over 100,000 men, marched into Bohemia. They encountered wagon forts and Hussite firepower and suffered devastating defeats. At the Battle of Kutna Hora in December 1421, Zizka, by now completely blind from wounds received in battle but still commanding, used the wagon fort in an offensive manoeuvre, advancing the wagons against Sigismund's army and breaking their lines. At subsequent battles, the mere sound of Hussite battle hymns being sung was enough to cause Crusader armies to flee without fighting. The wagon fort tactic spread beyond the Hussites. Hungarian commanders, particularly John Hunyadi, adopted the wagenburg and used it successfully against Ottoman Turkish armies in the Balkans in the 1440s. Bohemian mercenaries, veterans of the Hussite wars, hired themselves out to armies across Europe, bringing their tactics with them. The wagon fort became a standard element of military doctrine in Central and Eastern Europe for over a century. But the wagon fort's effectiveness was ultimately limited. It was a defensive weapon. Armies using wagon forts could withstand superior forces, but they couldn't conquer territory. You couldn't besiege cities from inside a wagon ring. The tactic was also vulnerable to determined infantry assault and to artillery. As field artillery improved through the 15th century, cannon could destroy wagon forts from standoff range. At the Battle of Wenzenbay in 1504, German Landsknechts, armed with pikes and early firearms, broke through a Bohemian wagon fort and routed the defenders. The age of the wagon fort was ending, but for 84 years, from 1420 to 1504, the wagon fort dominated Central European warfare, and it changed military thinking permanently. It demonstrated that infantry could defeat cavalry with proper preparation. It proved that firearms, even primitive ones, could change the balance of battlefield power. It showed that tactical innovation could overcome material disadvantage, and it established that common soldiers, peasants and townsmen could stand against professional warriors and win. Jan Zizka himself died on October 11th, 1424, from plague, not battle wounds. He was 64 years old and had been completely blind for over 2 years, yet he continued commanding armies and never lost a battle. His reputation was such that his followers, after his death, renamed their military contingent the Orphans, claiming that without Zizka they were orphans without a father. According to legend, Zizka ordered that after his death his skin should be made into a drumhead, so he could continue leading them in battle. Whether this happened is debated, but the legend itself speaks to the reverence his soldiers felt. Zizka was buried at an unknown location, possibly to prevent enemies from desecrating his remains. The Hussite wars continued for another decade after his death. The movement eventually splintered, radical and moderate factions turning on each other. In 1434, moderate Hussites allied with Catholics to crush the radical Taborites at the Battle of Lipany. Ending the main military phase of the conflict, the Catholic Church made limited concessions. The Hussites gained some of the reforms they had fought for, including communion in both kinds for laity, the chalice that became their symbol. But the broader revolution failed. Bohemia returned to Catholic control, though Hussite ideas survived underground to influence the Protestant Reformation a century later. The Battle of Sudoměř receives less attention than later Hussite victories. It was smaller, less dramatic than the defence of Prague or the great field battles against crusading armies. But Sudoměř was the crucible where the tactics that would dominate Hussite warfare were forged. It was the proof of concept. 400 people with 12 wagons had withstood 2,000 armoured cavalry for an entire day and survived. That survival proved it could be done. It proved that peasants could fight knights. It proved that firearms, even primitive ones, mattered. It proved that defensive fortifications didn't require stone walls and months of construction. It proved that tactical brilliance could overcome material disadvantage. After Sudoměř, the Hussites knew they could win. That confidence was worth armies. The wagon fort represented a specific response to specific circumstances. The Hussites lacked the resources for traditional military power. They couldn't afford heavy cavalry, couldn't produce plate armour in quantity, couldn't train professional soldiers, so they built their military around what they had. Wagons, which were plentiful and necessary for any army's logistics. Firearms, which were relatively cheap and required minimal training. Agricultural implements that every farmer owned. Faith and determination born of religious conviction and the knowledge that defeat meant execution. These were defensive weapons. The Hussites weren't trying to conquer Europe, they were trying to survive, but in creating a system to survive they revolutionized warfare. The parallels to later military innovations are striking. Just as the wagon fort protected infantry from cavalry, allowing firearms to be used effectively, tanks in World War I protected infantry from machine guns, allowing them to cross no man's land. Just as Hussite handgunners worked with crossbowmen, artillery and melee, troops in combined arms tactics, modern militaries coordinate infantry, armour, artillery and air support. Just as the wagon fort could advance, rolling forward to attack, modern mechanised infantry fights from armoured personnel carriers. The specific technology changes, the principles endure. At Sudoměř on March 25, 1420, 12 wagons chained together on a narrow dam between two ponds became the first tanks, the first mobile protected fighting positions. The Catholic knights who charged those wagons expected an easy victory. They got a revolution. The noise of those first handgun volleys, cracking across the muddy ground, marked the beginning of the end for the medieval military system. The age of the knight, of heavy cavalry, of aristocratic military dominance based on expensive equipment and years of training, was entering its final centuries. Gunpowder would finish the process that began at Sudoměř. The flails that cracked through plate armour demonstrated that common soldiers with proper tactics could defeat military elites. Jan Zizka, the one-eyed bandit turned revolutionary commander, proved that genius mattered more than resources. The Catholic nobles who refused to accept the Hussites' attempted surrender at Sudoměř thought they were about to teach peasants a lesson about knowing their place. Instead, those peasants taught Europe that the future of warfare belonged not to individual warriors, however skilled, but to disciplined formations using integrated tactics and firepower. The future belonged to systems, not heroes. When historians look at military history, certain battles mark transitions. Marathon proved that disciplined infantry could defeat numerically superior forces. Agincourt demonstrated the power of longbow-armed infantry against cavalry. Crécy showed that gunpowder weapons were changing warfare. Sudoměř belongs in that company. It was the first demonstration that firearm-equipped infantry behind mobile fortifications could defeat heavy cavalry. Every wagon fort that followed, every use of field fortifications to defeat cavalry, every integration of firearms into combined arms tactics traces its lineage back to those 12 wagons on a muddy dam. The Catholic knights who died there, crushed by flails or shot by handguns or drowned in armour in the sucking mud, died witnessing a new world being born. A world where birth and wealth and armour mattered less than discipline and tactics and firepower. A world where peasants could kill nobles. The Hussites lost their revolution in the end. The Catholic Church retained its power. The social changes the Taborites fought for didn't happen. But the military revolution couldn't be undone. You cannot uninvent gunpowder. You cannot forget tactics that work. Every army that witnessed or heard about Hussite victories understood that warfare had changed. The question wasn't whether to adapt, but how quickly. By the time European armies fought in the Italian wars of the early 1500s, pike and shot formations, combining pike-armed infantry with harquebusiers and artillery, had become standard. These formations were direct descendants of Hussite practice. The Spanish tercio, the most feared infantry formation of the 16th century, was a refinement of Hussite combined arms. The Swedish army of Gustavus Adolphus in the 30 Years' War used mobile artillery and integrated firepower in ways Zizka would have recognised. The wagon fort itself faded, replaced by better field fortifications and more effective infantry formations. But the ideas, the principles, those survived. Mobility, protection, firepower, integration. These principles, first demonstrated at Sudoměř, remain central to military operations 500 years later. When modern mechanised infantry dismounts from armoured personnel carriers to engage enemy forces while protected by vehicle-mounted weapons, they are executing a tactical concept born on a Bohemian dam in 1420. The technology has changed unimaginably. The principles endure. The Battle of Sudoměř was the moment when war wagons first rolled into battle and shocked European knights. But more than that, it was the moment when a one-eyed commander and 400 desperate people demonstrated that courage and intelligence could overcome overwhelming material disadvantage. That innovation mattered more than tradition. That the future could be seized by those brave enough to reimagine the possible. The knights who laughed at peasants hiding behind farm wagons learned too late that they were witnessing their own obsolescence. The thunder of handguns and the crack of flails on plate armour were sounds of a new age, an age where common people could challenge aristocratic power, where religious conviction could motivate armies, where technology and tactics mattered more than breeding and wealth. The Hussite wars were religious conflicts, but they were also class conflicts, military revolutions, technological transitions. At Sudoměř, all those currents met, and 12 wagons became a symbol of defiance that would echo through European history. The knights who died there, trapped in their armour in the mud, or crushed by flails or shot by crude firearms, died in a battle that should never have been fought. 400 peasants should have surrendered, but they didn't. And because they didn't, because Jan Zizka positioned his wagons between two ponds and dared professional warriors to come take them, the world changed. That's the power of Sudoměř. Not the number of casualties, not the strategic impact, which was limited, but the demonstration that war could be different, that innovation could defeat tradition, that the impossible could be achieved by those with nothing to lose and everything to fight for. Every underdog who's ever faced overwhelming odds and found a way to win carries a spark of what happened on that muddy dam in 1420. The war wagons rolled into battle. The knights charged in, confidence. And the world turned upside down. The aftermath of Sudoměř rippled through Europe faster than any army could march. News travelled by messenger, by merchant, by refugee. Within weeks, every court, every castle, every monastery from England to Hungary had heard some version of the story. Peasants had defeated knights. Farm carts had stopped cavalry charges. The natural order had been inverted. The Catholic response was denial mixed with rage. This couldn't be allowed to stand. The Hussites had gotten lucky, had used terrain advantages, had caught professional soldiers off guard. It wouldn't happen again. The Church and Empire would assemble proper armies, multiple crusades if necessary, and crush this heresy. Pope Martin V didn't just authorize one crusade. He authorized as many as it would take. Between 1420 and 1431, 5 major crusades were launched against Bohemia. Each one assembled armies numbering in the tens of thousands. German princes, Hungarian nobles, Polish knights, Italian mercenaries, volunteers from across Catholic Europe answered the call. These weren't ragtag forces. These were professional armies led by experienced commanders, equipped with the best weapons money could buy, motivated by religious fervour and promises of plunder. They marched into Bohemia, expecting to sweep aside peasant resistance. They encountered Jan Zizka's wagon forts. The Second Crusade came in the autumn of 1421. Emperor Sigismund, humiliated by his defeat at Witkov Hill the previous year, assembled a massive force. Estimates range from 50,000 to 100,000 men. The exact number is impossible to determine from medieval sources, but it was enormous by any standard. Sigismund's strategy was straightforward. Overwhelming force. His army would march through Bohemia, burning Hussite towns, executing heretics, restoring Catholic authority through terror. The campaign began successfully. Sigismund's forces captured several towns. Executions followed. Catholic priests absolved the crusaders of sins, promising heavenly reward for killing heretics. The army grew confident. Then they encountered Zizka at Kutna Hora in December 1421. Kutna Hora was a wealthy mining town in central Bohemia, source of silver that funded the Bohemian kingdom. Its loss would be both symbolic and economically devastating for the Hussites. Sigismund besieged the town with overwhelming force. Zizka, commanding perhaps 4,000 men, marched to relieve the siege. The odds were ludicrous, 4,000 against 50,000 or more. Sigismund could have sent a fraction of his army to destroy Zizka while maintaining the siege. Instead, he detached roughly 10,000 men under his best commanders and ordered them to annihilate the Hussite relief force. This was still better than 2-to-1 odds in favour of the Catholics. It should have been sufficient. Zizka formed his wagon fort on high ground outside Kutna Hora. By now his wagons were purpose-built war machines. He had approximately 400 wagons, creating a fortification that enclosed his entire army. Inside the ring, organisation was precise. Every man knew his position. Handgunners and crossbowmen were assigned to specific wagons. Melee troops waited behind the wagon walls. Cavalry, the Hussites had recruited some lesser nobles with horses, waited in reserve. Artillery pieces were positioned between wagons, loaded and ready. The Hussite army sang as they prepared. Battle hymns composed by Czech reformers, sung in Czech rather than Latin, voices raised in defiant faith. The sound carried across the winter landscape. The Catholics heard it, and some felt the first fingers of unease. There was something unsettling about an army that sang before battle, that seemed to welcome martyrdom. The Catholic commanders weren't worried. They had numbers, equipment, experience. They had defeated peasant uprisings before. This would be no different. They ordered a cavalry charge. Thousands of mounted knights in full plate armour accelerated toward the wagon fort. The ground shook. Lances lowered. This was the hammer blow that had broken armies for centuries. The Hussites let them come. Crossbowmen and handgunners held their fire until the cavalry was within killing range, perhaps 75 yards. Then the wagon fort erupted. Hundreds of handguns fired more or less simultaneously. The noise was incredible, a rolling thunder that echoed off the hills. Smoke obscured the battlefield. Through the smoke came crossbow quarrels, thousands of them, a storm of iron-tipped death. The cavalry charge disintegrated. Horses panicked, throwing riders. Men fell, pierced by quarrels. The survivors wheeled away, unable to reach the wagons. The Catholics reformed and tried again, and again. Each assault broke against the wagon walls. Each time more knights died. The handguns and crossbows never stopped firing, ranks rotating to maintain continuous volleys. By afternoon, the Catholic commanders realized frontal assault wouldn't work. They tried flanking maneuvers, probing for weak points in the wagon ring. There were none. Zizka had positioned his fort with all approaches covered. They tried to bring up their own artillery to bombard the wagons. Hussite cannons engaged them at range, disrupting their deployment. As the sun began setting, something extraordinary happened. Zizka ordered a counterattack. The wagons opened. Hussite infantry poured out, supported by their cavalry. They struck the Catholic forces while they were disorganized from repeated failed assaults. The Hussites had been fighting defensively all day. Now they attacked with the fury of religious conviction. Their flails and halberds crashed into tired, frustrated Catholic soldiers. The Catholic line broke. What began as an orderly withdrawal became a rout. 10,000 professional soldiers fled before 4,000 Hussites. The psychological impact was devastating. These were supposed to be the finest warriors in Europe, crusaders blessed by the Pope himself. They ran from peasants. Zizka pursued, his cavalry hunting down fleeing enemies. The casualties among the Catholics were catastrophic. Thousands died in the pursuit, cut down as they ran or captured and executed. The Hussite losses were minimal, perhaps a few dozen killed. Emperor Sigismund, learning of the disaster, abandoned the siege of Kutna Hora and withdrew his entire army from Bohemia. The Second Crusade had failed as spectacularly as the first. In Rome, Pope Martin V received the news with disbelief. How could this keep happening? The explanation from returning crusaders was always the same. The wagons, those accursed wagons, you couldn't get to them. The firearms and crossbows killed horses and men before you could close. If you dismounted and advanced on foot, the peasants would sally forth and attack while you were disordered. If you withdrew to regroup, they would advance the wagons and maintain pressure. There was no answer to them, but there had to be an answer. The Pope demanded it, the Emperor demanded it. Catholic commanders studied the problem. The wagon fort was a defensive fortification. Very well, don't attack it, bypass it. Engage the Hussites only when they were in the open, on the march, before they could form their wagons. This became the strategy for subsequent crusades. It failed. Hussite armies on the march moved with discipline. Scouts ranged far ahead, reporting enemy movements. At the first sign of threat, the wagons would stop, chain together, and form the fort. The process took less than an hour with practiced troops. Catholic armies attempting to catch Hussites in the open found themselves facing prepared defences every time. The Hussites could form their wagon fort faster than the Catholics could close to attack. Another strategy: siege them. A wagon fort couldn't move if you surrounded it. Cut off supplies, starve them out. This also failed. Hussite armies carried substantial supplies in their wagons. They could endure siege for days or weeks. More importantly, Hussite strategy involved multiple armies operating across Bohemia. If one army was besieged, others would march to relieve it. Catholic forces attempting to maintain a siege would find themselves attacked from outside by a relief force, while the besieged army sallied from within. The Catholics would be caught between two Hussite forces, a tactical nightmare. The Third Crusade came in 1422, led by the Archbishop of Prague and various German princes. They assembled another massive army, perhaps 60,000 men, and invaded from multiple directions, planning to converge on Prague. Zizka, commanding Hussite forces in eastern Bohemia, couldn't reach Prague in time, but he didn't need to. He led his army deep into Catholic territory, into Moravia and Hungary, raiding, burning, destroying. This was the offensive use of the wagon fort. Hussite armies could penetrate deep into enemy territory, protected by their mobile fortifications. They would raid a region for supplies, destroying what they couldn't carry, then form their wagon fort and dare anyone to attack. When Catholic forces assembled to oppose them, the Hussites would either fight from their wagons or withdraw under the protection of their mobile fortress. The strategy was devastating to civilian populations. Hussite raids left trails of destruction across Moravia, Silesia, and Hungary. Towns were burned, crops destroyed, populations fled before the approaching wagon trains. The Hussites gained a reputation for terror, partly deserved, partly propaganda spread by Catholic authorities. But the raids served their strategic purpose. They drew Catholic armies away from Bohemia, forcing them to defend their own territories. The Third Crusade dissolved as German princes withdrew to protect their own lands from Hussite incursions. By 1423, the Hussites weren't just defending Bohemia, they were projecting power beyond their borders, raiding deep into Catholic Europe. Wagon fort columns penetrated into Saxony, Bavaria, Austria. These raids, called beautiful rides by the Hussites, a term dripping with irony, spread terror across Central Europe. The psychological weapon of the wagon fort was fully realized. Its mere presence paralyzed enemy decision-making. In 1424, Jan Zizka died of plague during a campaign. He was 64 years old, completely blind, yet still commanding armies in the field. His death was a blow to Hussite morale, but his legacy lived on. His tactical innovations had been absorbed by other Hussite commanders. Prokop the Great, who assumed command of the main Hussite armies, was a brilliant strategist in his own right, who expanded on Zizka's methods. Under Prokop, the Hussites reached their peak military power. In 1427, the Fourth Crusade assembled. This time, the Catholic princes were determined. They gathered over 100,000 men, possibly the largest army assembled in Europe since the Roman Empire. This vast host invaded Bohemia from the west, from Saxony and Bavaria. The plan was simple: overwhelm the Hussites with sheer numbers, no tactics, no clever strategies, just mass. Prokop the Great met them at Tachov with roughly 25,000 Hussites. The odds were 4-1 against the Hussites. It didn't matter. As the Catholic army approached, the Hussites formed their wagon fort and began singing their battle hymns. The sound carried across the battlefield, thousands of voices raised in Czech, singing hymns about divine judgment and righteous warfare. The Catholics had heard these songs before. Veterans of previous crusades remembered what followed the singing: the wagon forts, the guns, the flails, the slaughter. Panic rippled through the Catholic ranks. Some units began withdrawing before the battle even started. Commanders shouted orders, trying to restore discipline. It was too late. The rearmost units, seeing the front ranks hesitating, assumed a retreat had been ordered. They turned and fled. The panic spread forward through the massive army like fire through dry grass. Within hours, over 100,000 men were fleeing in complete disorder, throwing away weapons and armour to run faster. The Hussites pursued, barely believing what they were witnessing. They captured thousands of abandoned wagons, artillery pieces, supplies. The Catholics lost their entire logistical train, without a real battle being fought. This became known as the Battle of Tachov, though battle is too generous a term. It was a rout caused entirely by psychological terror. The Crusader army fled at the sound of Hussite hymns. The Fourth Crusade collapsed in humiliation. The Pope was furious. The Emperor was desperate. How could over 100,000 men run from 25,000? The answer was simple. They had seen what happened to previous crusades. They knew about the wagon forts. They knew about the casualties. The profit and glory promised by crusading wasn't worth dying horribly in Bohemia. Better to run and live. By 1430, the Hussites were no longer just defending. They were expanding. Hussite armies raided deep into Germany, penetrating as far as the Baltic coast. They besieged cities in Saxony and Bavaria. Catholic princes paid tribute to make them leave. The Holy Roman Empire, the most powerful political entity in Europe, was being humiliated by a group of Czech heretics with farm wagons. The Fifth Crusade in 1431 was a last desperate attempt. Cardinal Giuliano Cesarini, the papal legate, assembled another massive force in Germany. Contemporary sources claim 150,000 men, though this is probably an exaggeration. Even accounting for medieval number inflation, this was an enormous army. Cesarini led them into Bohemia, reaching Domažlice in August 1431. Prokop the Great met them with his wagon forts. Before the armies even engaged, the Catholics broke. Veterans of previous crusades recognized the Hussite battle formation. They heard the hymns beginning to rise from the wagon fort. They remembered Tachov. The rearward units started withdrawing. The panic spread. Within hours, the entire Crusader army was fleeing in complete disorder. Cardinal Cesarini barely escaped with his life, abandoning his cardinal's hat and regalia in his haste to flee. This was the last crusade. The Catholic Church had exhausted its ability to raise armies against the Hussites. 5 separate crusades, hundreds of thousands of men, vast expenditures of wealth and resources, all defeated. The wagon fort had proven strategically invincible. Not because it couldn't be beaten in theory, sufficient artillery could eventually break any fortification, but because the psychological terror it induced prevented rational tactical responses. Catholic soldiers simply would not fight Hussite wagon forts anymore. The fear was too great. After Domažlice, negotiations began. The Catholics couldn't defeat the Hussites militarily. The Hussites couldn't convert all of Europe to their reforms. Compromise became necessary. The Council of Basel, beginning in 1431, sought religious reconciliation. The negotiations dragged on for years, complicated by divisions within the Hussite movement itself. The moderate Utraquists were willing to compromise. The radical Taborites, heirs to Zizka's tradition, demanded complete reform and would accept nothing less. In 1434, the split became violent. Moderate Hussites, allied with Catholic Bohemian nobles, turned on the radicals. At the Battle of Lipany on May 30th, 1434, Utraquist forces defeated the Taborites using, ironically, wagon fort tactics learned from Zizka. Prokop the Great died in the battle. The Taborite military power was broken. The Hussite wars were effectively over. The Peace of Jihlava in 1436 granted the Hussites some of their demands. Communion in both kinds was allowed. Church property seized by the Hussites was legitimized. Czech rather than German influence in Bohemia was recognized. These were significant concessions, but far short of the complete reformation the radicals had demanded. The Catholic Church retained its power and authority. The social revolution failed, but the military revolution succeeded beyond anyone's imagination. The wagon fort had fundamentally changed how European armies thought about warfare. Its influence persisted long after the Hussite wars ended. In Hungary, John Hunyadi adopted the wagon fort in his campaigns against the Ottoman Turks in the 1440s and 1450s. At the Battle of Belgrade in 1456, Hunyadi used fortified positions combining wagons, artillery and firearms to defeat a massive Ottoman siege army. The Sultan Mehmed II, who had conquered Constantinople 3 years earlier, was wounded in the battle and forced to withdraw. The wagon fort had proven effective even against the most advanced military power of the era. In Moldavia, Stephen the Great used similar tactics against both Ottoman and Polish invasions in the late 15th century, achieving an extraordinary record of military success. The wagon fort principle spread east into Muscovy. Russian armies facing Mongol and Tatar cavalry raids adopted Guliai Gorod, mobile wooden fortifications that functioned identically to Hussite wagon forts. These fortifications remained part of Russian military doctrine into the 16th century. In Western Europe, the wagon fort was less influential but still significant. Swiss pike formations and German Landsknecht units studied Hussite tactics. While they didn't adopt the wagons, they incorporated the principles: dense infantry formations using combined arms, pikes for close combat, crossbows and later arquebuses for ranged fire, all working together in disciplined units. The Spanish tercio, which dominated European battlefields in the 16th century, was a direct descendant of this tactical lineage. Even more, significantly, the Hussite wars demonstrated the military effectiveness of firearms. Before 1420, handguns were curiosities, toys, weapons of questionable utility. After the Hussite wars, every European army prioritized firearm development. Handguns evolved into arquebuses, then muskets, then rifles. Artillery developed from crude siege weapons into sophisticated battlefield instruments. By 1500, the transformation was complete. Firearms dominated warfare, and it all traced back to Czech peasants with primitive handguns firing from behind wagon walls at Sudoměř. The social impact was equally profound. The Hussite wars demonstrated that common people could successfully resist aristocratic and ecclesiastical power. The idea was revolutionary. Throughout medieval society, hierarchy was considered divinely ordained. Nobles ruled because God had placed them above commoners. The Church mediated between humanity and divine authority. To resist either was to resist God's order. The Hussites rejected this entirely. They argued that Scripture, not church hierarchy, was the ultimate authority. They claimed that righteousness and faith, not birth and wealth, determined worth. They proved through military victory that commoners could defeat nobles. These ideas were dangerous to the entire feudal system. They inspired resistance movements across Europe. The German Peasants' War of 1524 to 1525, though it failed, drew inspiration from Hussite precedent. The Protestant Reformation, beginning in 1517, built on foundations the Hussites had laid. Martin Luther himself acknowledged his debt to Jan Hus. When Luther was accused of heresy, he responded that Hus had been unjustly condemned. Luther's reforms, which split Christianity and reshaped Europe, followed paths the Hussites had pioneered. the intellectual impact extended into military theory. Renaissance military writers studied the Hussite wars intensively. Niccolò Machiavelli, in his Art of War published in 1521, analysed Hussite tactics and recommended incorporating their innovations. He particularly praised their use of field fortifications and integration of infantry and firearms. Military academies across Europe studied Zizka's campaigns as examples of tactical brilliance. The Prussian military theorist Karl von Clausewitz, writing in the early 19th century, examined the Hussite wars as a case study in how inferior forces could use geography, fortification, and superior tactics to defeat stronger enemies. The wagon fort's decline came gradually. As field artillery improved through the 15th and 16th centuries, stationary fortifications became increasingly vulnerable. Cannon that could breach castle walls could certainly destroy wooden wagons. More importantly, professional infantry armed with pikes and firearms proved capable of defeating cavalry without needing mobile fortifications. The Spanish tercio could stand in the open against cavalry charges, using pikes to hold off horsemen, while arquebusiers fired volleys. The Swiss pike square was nearly invincible against cavalry in the open field. These formations were more flexible than wagon forts, capable of rapid manoeuvre, pursuing defeated enemies, exploiting breakthrough opportunities. The wagon fort, for all its defensive strength, was ultimately a static defence. But the principles never died. They evolved. The idea that infantry could defeat cavalry through combined arms, firepower, and fortification became orthodox military doctrine. The concept of mobile protected firepower persisted through centuries. Naval warfare developed along similar lines, ships becoming mobile gun platforms. In the 20th century, the tank emerged as a direct conceptual descendant of the war wagon, a mobile fortification carrying firepower, protecting soldiers while projecting combat power. The parallels are striking. Tanks revolutionized warfare in World War I just as war wagons revolutionized warfare in the 15th century. Both allowed infantry to advance under protection. Both combined mobility with fortification. Both used firepower to suppress enemies while closing to decisive range. Both created psychological terror in opponents. German soldiers in 1916, facing tanks for the first time, experienced the same shock that Catholic knights felt facing wagon forts in 1420. Modern mechanized warfare, infantry fighting from armoured vehicles, directly echoes Hussite practice. Armoured personnel carriers are high-tech wagon forts. Infantry deploys from them to fight, falls back to their protection when pressed, uses vehicle-mounted weapons for fire support. The tactics Zizka pioneered 600 years ago with wooden wagons and primitive firearms remain fundamental to military operations today, with steel vehicles and advanced weapons. The genius of the wagon fort wasn't the wagons themselves. The genius was recognizing that mobility, protection, and firepower could be combined in revolutionary ways. That infantry didn't need to stand in the open trading blows with cavalry. That fortification didn't need to be static. That defensive weapons could enable offensive operations. That common soldiers with adequate protection and weapons could defeat military elites. These insights transformed warfare permanently. The Battle of Sudoměř, that confused, brutal, muddy fight on a dam between two ponds, was where these insights were proven in combat for the first time. 12 wagons chained together, 400 desperate people, 2,000 armoured knights. When the sun set on March 25th, 1420, the world was different. Not dramatically, not obviously. The same kingdoms existed. The same pope ruled in Rome. The same emperor claimed authority. But something had shifted fundamentally. The impossible had happened, and once people know the impossible is possible, everything changes. That's the true legacy of Sudoměř and the Hussite wars. Not the immediate political outcomes, which were mixed, not the religious reforms, which were ultimately limited, but the demonstration that determined people using innovation and intelligence could overcome overwhelming material disadvantage, that the established order wasn't invincible, that new ideas could defeat old ones, that common people mattered. The Catholic knights who charged those wagons at Sudoměř thought they were suppressing a peasant rebellion. They thought they were defending the natural order. They thought they were serving God. They died learning they were wrong. The peasants they dismissed as rabble. The wagons they thought would be swept aside. The crude firearms they considered novelties, all combined into something new and deadly. 500 years later, we remember Jan Žižka as one of history's great commanders. We remember the Hussite Wars as a pivotal moment in European history. We remember the wagon fort as a revolutionary military innovation. But in 1420, it was just desperate people trying to survive, making the best of what they had. Zizka didn't set out to revolutionize warfare. He set out to protect his followers from annihilation. The tactical innovations came from necessity. But that's how most revolutions happen. Not through grand planning, but through intelligent responses to immediate crises. Someone faces an impossible problem and finds an unexpected solution. That solution works. Others copy it. The innovation spreads. The world changes. At Sudoměř, the impossible problem was 400 people against 2,000 knights. The unexpected solution was chaining wagons together and fighting from behind them. It worked. Others copied it. The innovation spread. The world changed. The war wagons rolled into battle. The knights charged. And nothing was ever quite the same.